Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Waddell. It's been my pleasure to be one of the members of the organizing committee for this conference, and it's my privilege to introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker, Rudi ter Velde. Professor ter Velde earned his PhD at the Free University Amsterdam under the supervision of Jan Artsen. He has taught at the Free University and the University of Amsterdam and held visiting professorships in Taiwan and Colombia. He currently holds a special chair in the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas at the School of Theology of Tilburg University. He's also a member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and was for many years a member of the Thomas Institute, Utrecht. Professor ter Velde's scholarship has explored an expansive range of themes in Thomism, metaphysics, philosophy of religion, theology, ethics, and anthropology, though he never strays very far from fundamental questions about God and creation. His first book, Participation and Substantiality in Thomas Aquinas, is, in my opinion, required reading for anyone who wants to understand the Neoplatonic elements of Aquinas' thought. And everyone should want to understand the Neoplatonic elements of Aquinas' thought. In this important work, Professor ter Velde provided a compelling reconciliation of what he has described as Aquinas' basically Aristotelian philosophical orientation with the importance of the metaphysics of participation and Thomas's account of creation. This was no mean feat, and his magisterial handling of it earned him a place alongside, or one might even say ahead of, legendary predecessors like Geiger and Fabro. Since Participation and Substantiality, Professor ter Velde has published more than 130 articles in several books, including Aquinas on God, The Divine Science of the Summa Theologia, Metaphysics Between Experience and Transcendence, Thomas Aquinas on Metaphysics as a Science, and the forthcoming Thomas Aquinas on the Good, Moral Life, and Happiness. Professor ter Velde's address this afternoon is entitled Signatum est super nos, Participation in Natural Law. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Michael, for this kind and flattering introduction. It's a great honor to be invited to speak here at this Aquinas at 800 conference. 800 years is a long time in terms of human history. To outsiders, it may seem astonishing that after such a long time, there are still people reading Aquinas and coming together to discuss his thought. Perhaps the real miracle is that the Thomas we are interested in, his thought and his writings, remain forever young. One has seldom the feeling that his ideas are outdated and coming from far away. Thus, let us read and talk Aquinas. My talk will be on the notion of participation as it is used in the context of Thomas' treatise on natural law, the Lex Naturalis. In the foundational text on natural law, in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, participation plays a relatively small but important role, characteristic of Thomas' synthetic way of thinking. A close look at the use of participation in this context will, I hope, give us access to the general idea of natural law, as it is to be understood both in its relation to God and in its relation to human reason. We find, for example, that in a treatise on law, natural law is defined as nothing else than the participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. In other words, natural law is the eternal law, is the internal law, as participated in that specific creature endowed with reason, which happens to be ourselves. These last words are not unimportant. Such reference to the subject avoids a purely objective and neutral way of speaking. There's a natural law in nobis, in us human beings, Thomas says. Natural law is thus, according to this definition, derived from the eternal law of God and is the normative foundation of practical reason in its role of regulating human acts. It is, I suppose, a familiar definition, part of the doctrine of law which has received immense attention in the last 800 years of philosophical and theological engagement with the legacy of Thomas Aquinas. That's why I felt at first a slight hesitation to talk about natural law here. Perhaps it's just idle pretension to try to add something new to the endless work of interpretation and debate around natural law. We shall see. But it has struck me that in much of the contemporary literature on natural law ethics, the definition of natural law is rendered in a way that I think is incorrect, or at least disputable, suggesting a more Augustinian understanding of participation rather than an authentic Thomistic one. What one often sees in the literature is that the definition has been reformulated in such a way that natural law is said to participate in the eternal law of God. This is not an accidental slip of the tongue. The preposition in is used here in the sense of a relationship of sharing in a transcendent principle, God's law of God's wisdom. Participation here is understood implicitly or explicitly in a way that more or less betrays the belief that natural law cannot fulfill its normative role in human life without being related to the eternal law of God. The focus is on the theological dependence of natural law on the transcendent law of God. So participation is understood as being dependent on and receiving from a transcendent principle. I mentioned just one example of this reading of natural law, the well-known encyclical Veritas Splendor of Pope John Paul II, published in 1993. An important theological theme in this encyclical is the dependence of human practical reason on divine wisdom as the source of moral truth. This divine wisdom is found in God's eternal law. The letter argues against, and I quote, a complete sovereignty of reason, end of quote, with regard to the moral ordering of human life in this world. It criticizes the tendency in contemporary moral theology to make natural law a law of human autonomy, which denies the fact that, and I quote, natural law has God as its author, and that man, through the use of his reason, participates in the eternal law, which is not for him to establish, end of quote. But here we see that the encyclical speaks of participation, but in a sense that departs from Aquinas himself, and that it emphasizes the dependence of natural law, the law of human reason, on the eternal law of God. The encyclical quotes Pope Leo XIII, who asserted that, I quote, the prescriptions of human reason cannot have the force of law unless it were the voice and interpreter of a higher reason, to which our spirit and our freedom must be subject. End of quote. The same text is quoted in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, in the chapter on the natural law of morality. I must confess that I find this view problematic, not only as an interpretation of Aquinas, but also as a philosophical position in its own right. It betrays a certain lack of trust in human reason, I think, of a weakening of the normative force of natural law as the law of practical reason. In what follows, I will propose a reading of Thomas' view of natural law with a dual focus on the relationship between the eternal law of God and natural law on the one hand, and the relationship between nature, that is the nature we are, and reason on the other. The difficulty of arriving at a satisfactory interpretation of natural law has, I think, one of its main causes in how to formulate the precise relationship between the three constitutive dimensions of natural law. It is first of all a law of reason, or the first principles of practical reason, and as such, the normative foundation of human law and morality. It is also a law of nature, that is, of human nature, human rational nature, the nature that we are, with a specific theological orientation towards the human good. And at the same time is a law of God, as creator and governor of the universe. Natural law is therefore law of reason, the law of nature, and the law of God, who moves every creature from within towards its end and its good. The point I want to make in this talk is that these three dimensions of natural law should not be seen as external to each other, to one another, as if reason, which is in itself a formal principle for ordering human action, must consult nature and its inner tendencies in order to formulate its first precepts, and then to acknowledge God's law as the higher normative function, as a higher normative source of the order of nature, which reason must obey. There are rather, I want to suggest, different depth dimensions of one law, which is the law of reason, through which nature speaks, in a certain sense, the nature that we are, and also God, the creator of nature. Now, let us begin with clarifying the meaning of participation in a defining formula of natural law. This formula is introduced in the second article of question 91 in the prima secundae of the Summa, where the question is asked whether there is a natural law in us, in nobis. What Thomas wants to make clear in this text is that there is indeed a natural law in us, an innate moral consciousness, call it, not so much as distinct from the eternal law, but rather as a sort of modification of the eternal law in the rational creature that we are. Natural law is not so much a law that comes after the eternal law, as if it were a second in a series of different kinds of law. To explain this modification, the way in which the eternal law is said to be in the human creature, Thomas quotes from Psalm 4. Many say, who shows us good things? To which question the psalmist replies, the light of your face, O Lord, is shined upon us. Signatum est super nos lumen vultus tui, Domine. This text is very dear to Thomas. He mentioned it often, and always with particular emphasis on the word signatum, a word whose meaning is closely related to Thomas' use of participation. Signatum, at least participation in this context. Signatum has here the sense of marked, inscribed, impressed. The passage from Psalm 4 is used to illustrate the relationship between the divine light, the light of the divine mind, and the natural light of man, one derived from the other. Human nature receives within itself a reflection of the divine light, not in a superficial or external way, but in the form of a natural light that constitutes us in our own intellectual nature. Characteristic of Aquinas' position is that nature, in this case rational nature, is established in its own immanent order by way of participation. So the impression of God's light in us becomes our own light, part of what we are, and by which we are able to know the truth by ourselves. It's not without reason that Thomas refers to the same text of the Psalm 4 in his critical reaction of the Augustinian notion of enlightenment, of illuminatio. He is not so much concerned with dependence as such, that's not a problem, but with the dependence that what he is aiming at is a dependence that constitutes the human mind in its own natural light. I quote, "The light of your face, Lord, is written on us." This means that the light of natural reason, by which we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, is nothing other than an imprint of impressio, and the Latin has impressio. Nothing other than an impression of the divine light on us. It is evident then that the natural law is nothing other than the participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. End of quote. Dus is participatio legis aeternae in rationali creatura. You can see it in the handout. It is not said that the rational creature participates in the eternal law, as if participation stands for a relation of transcendence. Participation is used here in the sense of receiving an impression that becomes part of our created nature. Impressio, that is Thomas' translation of the word signatum. It is important to see that participation does not mean here only dependence, of merely dependence. It is dependence, creation, a total dependence that leads to an immanent nature, to what we are, what we are in ourselves, to our own reason by which we are able to discern what is good and what is evil. It is the light of practical reason that constitutes man in his moral agency, acting by himself and ordering his acts in relation to the human good. The use of participation in the context of Thomas' account of natural law entails a complex relationship between transcendence and immanence. There is indeed a full and total dependency on a transcendent principle called the eternal law, but not at the expense of what things are in themselves, their nature, of their substance. What I see in Thomas is first of all a downward movement, a participation in the sense of an impression received from a higher cause. Whereas in much Thomistic literature on natural law, the accent is on the opposite upward movement. From the moral law in us to the eternal law of God, on which it depends and from which it is derived. And often a critical agenda is involved. One is interested in showing that the natural law and human morality based on it cannot stand on its own, that is not a law of human sovereign freedom, a freedom which is itself a source of moral norms, but has its theological foundation in God's law. Some even speak of, in this connection, of a participated theonomy, since man's free obedience to God's law effectively implies that human reason and will participate in God's wisdom and providence. And often a specific theological motive is at work here. One takes a stand against what one sees as a modern and secular conception of natural law. Such a view of natural law without a theological foundation, that is, without participation in a higher law, is advocated, for example, by Liska in his book Aquinas' Theory of Natural Law, where he wants to argue that, and I quote, Aquinas could provide an account of natural law without any reference to eternal law. There is a conceptual secularism in his theory of natural law, end of quote. So in contrast to this view of natural law without eternal law, stands then the theological position that natural law participates in the eternal law of God and derives its normative power as law from this higher law. Now, the hidden presupposition of both alternatives is that natural law is something different from eternal law, and that eternal law refers primarily to God's law. But then the formulation used by Thomas becomes incomprehensible. Natural law is nothing else than a participation of the eternal law in the rational creature. Natural law is the eternal law as participated in the rational creature. This is not the same as saying that the human reason, in its normative role, is somehow open to and receives from the eternal law of God, nor that natural law functions as law even in the abstraction from the eternal law. Let us now look more closely at how Thomas argues from the eternal law to from the eternal law to the natural law, or how he introduced the idea of a natural law starting from the eternal law. Two preliminary remarks. First, the eternal law, insofar as it is identical with God himself, is unknowable to us. It is known only indirectly through the way in which it is expressed in creatures. This fact makes it difficult, not to say impossible, to justify the basic precepts of natural law by trying to reduce them to the normative content of the eternal law. The eternal law is not accessible apart from how the law of practical reason and how the specific theological structure of the human creature is taken up in that law. So what God requires of human beings is nothing else than to fulfill their human telos and to live a good and just life. And this is not something about which we need to be informed by the eternal law itself, since we all know this from the law that God has inscribed in the hearts of all human beings, the law of our natural reason. So there's no access to the eternal law apart from the natural law in us, and thus not an independent theological justification of the natural law. My second remark is this. The moral law of nature is the law of God. This is true, it's okay. But the God of the eternal law is not quite the same as the God of biblical faith, who reveals his law and instructs the community of believers through his law, how to live a good life in view of their final destination in God. If the eternal law is what God commands us to do, then it is a command that works through our nature and becomes known as a normative principle in the light of our reason. And in this sense, it is known by nature to all human beings, irrespective of any particular religious tradition. I like to put it in this way. What I, as a rational creature, master of my own acts, free to will, and have to will, is, in the deepest sense, not different from what God, who created me as a specific human being that I am, endowed with reason and free will, wants me to will and to do. In this sense, the immanent law of human reason cannot be trampled by the eternal law as a sovereign will of a transcendent God unless one is confronted with a revelation of God's will. Compare the story of Abraham's sacrifice. There's at first sight a clash between a sort of order of natural morality and God's will who reveals himself. Now, crucial to our understanding of the concept of eternal law is Thomas' distinction between the eternal law as such and eternal law as expressed in the order of creatures. The eternal law as such is the plan of God's reason, according to which he governs the whole universe in view of the common good. It is the law of God's providence, to which all creatures are subject. And providence is not something that works from without. It works through the inner inclinations and operations of things. And the eternal law then has a double mode of existence. As rule and measure, law in the proper sense of the word, and as such it exists in God, and as ruled and measured, law in a derived sense, and as such it exists in the objects which are ruled and measured by this law. And each creature can be said to be a kind of embodiment of the eternal law. The eternal law may thus be said to be in things, to exist in things, or things participate in this law, but not as law, but insofar as the eternal law is expressed in the inclinations of things to the proper acts and ends. Things act in a certain characteristic way. They seek to fulfill the proper ends and to realize the good that corresponds to the nature. That is what they participate in, then, is the eternal law of God's providence as expressed in the immanent theological order of nature. Participation here means having an immanent impression received from a transcendent principle. And the law of providence is expressed in the specific inclinations of things to their proper acts and ends. The next step in Thomas' argument concerns the distinctive way in which the rational creature is subject to God's providence and has part in the eternal law. Be careful, have part in eternal law. The rational creature is subject to God's providence in a more excellent way, Thomas says, in the sense that he even becomes a participant of providence. Ipsa fit providentiae particips. There is another occurrence of participation in a formulation that's not so easy to interpret it. Like other creatures, human creatures are ruled in their operations, but they also rule themselves in their acts in view of the good, and thus they can be said to exercise in their life a form of providence for themselves and for others. So, as God exercise his providence in relation to the universe in its whole, as a whole, so the human beings, the rational creatures, exercise a kind of providence in relation to the domain of human affairs. Human creatures act on the basis of what I call rational self-government. They act by reason and free will in view of what they judge to be good and just. In this context, participation is used in a more pregnant sense, not only in a basic ontological sense, but even in a noetic sense, which is hinted at in the psalm text, what the Signatum super knows. In human creatures, the eternal law is participated in a more excellent way, namely even as law, that is, in its proper ruling function. Its impression on rational creatures takes the self-conscious form of knowledge, of the participation of the eternal law is received here in the self-reflective form of the light of practical reason, in which the first normative principles of human actions are naturally known. Law is something of reason. Without reason, there's no law. Law is something constitutum by reason, Thomas says. This means, I think, that the normativity of practical norms has its immediate source in reason. Practical reason contains in itself a norm, a first principle of regulation, by means of which it can fulfill a task, that is to regulate actions that are willed in view of an end and a good. So the first principle simply says, do what is good and avoid what is bad. The good must be done. Rational creatures, then, have within themselves a moral law which guides them in the choices they have to make in their lives. They have a normative principle of their own, which is nothing else than the eternal law in its self-reflective expression, the lumen signatum super nos. But there's a complication which makes the interpretation of natural law so difficult at this point. Rational creatures are not only rational and self-reflective, they have a typical double status. As creatures, we are measured in our actions by the immanent law of God's providence. God's providential law embodied in the reality that we are in the form of the natural inclinations to the proper acts and ends. So the human being is not an exception. It has also natural inclination to its proper acts and ends. To be the creatures we are, with a particular nature and corresponding inclinations, is not our own choice. At the same time, this law of providence is reflected in the natural law of our reason, by which we ourselves govern and measure our acts. We are masters of our actions, responsible for what we are doing. This is the work of freedom. But what we regulate according to the normative principles of reason is the reality of human life with its specific characteristics, its needs, and its fulfilling goods. What it means to be a human, and to live a good human life is not something arbitrary. Thus, the first precept of natural law, to do good and to avoid evil, cannot remain an abstract formal principle. The good to be done must be specified in the light of the inclinations in their goods that define what a good and fulfilled human life is. Now, the so-called natural inclinations, they play an essential role in Thomas' doctrine of natural law. The first and basic precepts of natural law are said to be derived or taken from these inclinations. How exactly this is done is not easy to explain. In my opinion, the relationship between reason in its normative role and natural inclinations is often described in a too external way. Inclinations are not part of nature, taken in contrast to the dimension of subjectivity and freedom. One should just be careful here to avoid any form of dualism. The inclinations are not simply pre-given to my rational will. In a sense, they express exactly what I, at a deeper level of my identity as a human being, will and recognize as a human good. Now, let's try to clarify just somewhat. Now, let's try to clarify the precise relationship between the natural inclinations and the first principle of practical reason. I will take one inclination in particular as example, the inclination to the preservation of life. From the perspective of the lex naturalis, we can say that the natural inclination to preserve life, the inclination we share with all living beings, opens up the field of values associated with life. From the perspective of life is a fundamental good that is affirmed in every activity of a living being. In natural law, this fundamental respect for life is expressed in the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Now, why, one may wonder, is dit een precept of natural law? Is life a good that must be unconditionally respected, preserved, and promoted, even when it is one's own life? Or is life a good precisely because it is my life, the life that I possess and therefore have at my disposal? In the latter case, I have a moral duty to respect the life of everyone else and not to harm it, not so much because life in itself is an unconditional good, but because each other person has a right to his or her own life, and I should not violate that right. The prohibition against killing people, one might argue, would then not apply to one's own life, because the contingent fact that I exist and live cannot impose a moral obligation on me. Now, this is a typically modern liberal line of reasoning that underpins the widespread belief in our culture that in certain circumstances, people have the right to end their own life, possibly with the help of others. What is called assisted suicide. One's own life would not be worth living in all circumstances. But natural law makes reason to acknowledge that it is not permissible to take one's own life. The prohibition against killing human beings includes the human being that one is itself, that one is oneself. Now, let us carry on the debate between the two positions a little further. Not everyone will be prepared to accept this consequence. Why should people not have the right to end their own life if it is full of misery and suffering? In our secular culture, this is taken for granted by many. Why should it not be morally permissible in certain cases when the burden of life has become too heavy to end one's life? Even if one accepts a natural inclination towards the good of life, and we normally seek to preserve life and oppose everything that threatens it, does that inclination entail an obligation for me to live and to go on living? Is this what nature wants in us, to live at all cost? Now, it is important to see that for Thomas, nature and its inclinations do not immediately and as such have the character of a normative precept. Natural law does not mean that nature itself has the character of a law, or perhaps one can say that nature wants to live, I mean the nature and us, but it only becomes a normative principle concerning the preservation of life when it is taken up by reason and it becomes part of the law of reason. Only then can nature be a source of moral obligation, if the object of his inclination is apprehended by reason as good, thus as something to be pursued. Nature is not something external to reason, to what I will and have to will. I relate to my nature as my nature, and I accept nature's will to preserve life as my will. If this is the case, then there is, according to natural law, a sort of practical contradiction in the act of suicide. After all, life is not a limited value to be weighed against other values. One cannot say, for the sake of a higher value, to which I attach greater importance, I choose to cancel my life, insofar as the actual condition of this life, full of unbearable misery, makes the pursuit of the higher values, well-being, autonomy, meaningful human relationships, etc., are impossible or at least very difficult. For in canceling my own life, I simultaneously cancel all other values of life, which I cannot help but affirm and acknowledge at the same time. The reason for this is that all other values are only values to the extent that they give meaning and fulfillment to the basic value of life. So in the case of suicide, one no longer wants to live in this way, considering the miserable condition of this life, and in seeking to cancel this undesirable condition, one cancels one's life as such. This is what I mean by practical contradiction. By choosing one's own death because one's life seems to lack the values according to which it is desirable, one cancels what is necessarily willed as ground and meaning of every choice. This life is a fundamental value that is affirmed in every human act and is understood a priori, that means for Thomas naturally, spontaneously, as a good to be respected and affirmed by practical reason. Now, when in this context one speaks of a natural inclination to the good of life, nature does not stand for a factual inclination, perceived or otherwise, which lies outside my freely willed acts and which would bind my freedom in an external and therefore accidental way. The moral argument cannot be as follows. You want to die, I fully understand your wish, but your nature, which is the work of God, forbids you to carry out this wish. But because your nature wants to live. Now, the urge to live, if you formulate it in this way, cannot be external to the will, as if it were merely a biological urge to survive, which the will can also possibly eliminate or oppose. It is a natural inclination, an inclinatio in me as a living and physical being, which is included in every freely willed act as my inclination and will to live. Will to live that I have not freely chosen, but which is nevertheless my will. Natural law is the law of reason. Formulating laws and rules to regulate human acts is the work of reason. The work of practical reason, in a broader sense, consists in the virtuous ordering of human life. in the creation of a moral and political order in which the human good is to be realized. This is the work of freedom, but it is derived from principles known by nature. In this sense, natural law is the normative foundation of the lex humana. It is the law of reason ut natura, reason as the starting point for its discursive and free work of inventing norms and formulating laws. Now, I have come to the end of my talk. First some water. In the contemporary debate on natural law, two positions can be distinguished concerning the relationship between natural law and eternal law. According to one, natural law can function perfectly as law even without God of his eternal law. It allows for a secular interpretation that makes it acceptable in modern secular society, perhaps. The other position stresses the intrinsic dependence on the eternal law of God. No law without God as the ultimate lawgiver. Now, I hope to have shown that both positions are based on a false assumption. There's no natural law without the eternal law. For natural law is nothing but the eternal law as participated in the rational creature. Natural law is the law of rational self-government. Now, what might serve as a conclusion? It is in light of practical reason that the basic orientation to human goods, the reflection of the eternal law in us, gets normative value for our rational self-government. Thank you.
We have just over 10 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please approach one of the two microphones on either side of the room, and I'll let Professor Velde call questions.
Who was first? You?
Thanks for the very interesting talk. I was wondering if you could comment, you've spoken a lot, it seemed to me, of the originative source of the law, like whether, it's nature, it's the divine. And I'm wondering if you could comment maybe on looking at the end of the law. So if we look at human government, we say that, the authority governs justly for the sake of the body of the people, for the common good. And I'm wondering if we can maybe contrast that with the way that divine governance works, which is definitely for the sake of the natural objects, and that's the natural inclinations you were talking about, but also, and through that, for an extrinsic end, which is God's glory. So I was wondering, if you had any thoughts or comments about how that would impact how we see natural law.
Okay, thank you. It's important questions. First of all, I didn't discuss the definition of law with its common good and its community, because I think that the common definition is not applied in the same sense on the different kinds of law. So it's complicated, the discussions a lot. That's first. And second, I restricted myself to what is called in the Thomistic world the natural order. So I put the divine law of his revelation, of God's revelation, between brackets. Maybe that's a deadly sin in Thomistic world, I'm not sure, but it's a way of clarifying things better. So what is the end if you are asking the question, what is the end of the law? Law in the sense of natural law and the human laws based on it, then one must say it's the realizing of the telos of the human being. And that's the human good, whatever way you may interpret it. But the human good is the horizon of human action guided by law. That's first. Second, if you want to give revelation, Old Testament, New Testament, the law of Moses, and the grace of Jesus Christ, if you want that make a part of the discussion, then some things will change. There is not, the human telos has a different sense, according to the level of nature and the level of the supernatural fulfillment of matter. There's all complications. So I like to keep it simple, but there's a lot more to tell about this. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Very important topic and quite enlightening. I wonder if you could comment on another aspect that arises in question 94 of the Prima Secundae when it comes to the comparison between the principles that are known for speculative reason and the precepts known for practical reason. Because Thomas does something here which still perplexes me a bit, and Professor Tuninetti, who happens to be sitting right here, has helped me to think about this topic quite a bit. It's the distinction between the way that precepts are known, and so we have that those that are per se, note, secundum se, but then more interestingly, it's with a quo ad nos, because the distinction is between those that are known communiter omnibus, but then I think most interesting is those that are known soli sapientibus. Now, it seems to me that this is another piece of evidence for the ordering that you are stressing in this talk between the eternal law and the natural law. Insofar as Thomas doesn't go into, satisfactory explanation, I think, of why he's introducing the perse notus sapientibus in question 94. But it seems to me it has something to do with the fact that it is possible through wisdom to see more clearly those precepts of practical reason, precisely as a finis, so to speak, which is in the natural law. That is, in every single precept that has to do with practical reason, the wise happens to see it precisely as a participation in the eternal law. And maybe those who are not wise, they still have knowledge of those precepts in a way, but in some way which he doesn't fully disclose or describe at that point.
Yeah, thank you. Very difficult question. Article 2, the second article of question 94 is one of the most difficult and even most intriguing, interesting text of the whole treatise on law. And I read it often, many times, and I must confess there are still elements in it I don't understand. But the simple idea is, Thomas, the question concerns about does the natural law contains one precept or many? The answer is, in certain sense one, in certain sense many. The many is a kind of articulation of the one and basic precept. And yet, in those many, you can't go on endlessly with that many. But the many is filled in the text with help of the inclinationis naturalis. But in a certain sense, is every act of virtue belongs to the natural law, you can say that. But now, natural law of practical reason, that the distinction between principles known only by the wise and known by everyone, I can't explain that to you at this moment. I have no answer to that question. Maybe someone else. But what Thomas is doing is, now let us draw a kind of analogy between theoretical reason, theoretical intellect. The first concept of the theoretical intellect is being, and in the light of being, immediately some principles are known, per se, naturally, the principle of non-contradiction. Now, in a similar way, you can take practical reason. Practical reason, what is the first concept, the first idea falling in practical reason? Practical reason, the task of practical reason is regulating human actions. Actions for the sake of an end. And the end has a character of a good. Thus, the most important notion of practical reason is the good. So that is not being, the good is the first concept of practical reason. The first principle, immediately what is immediately known on the basis of that concept is the good is what all desire, and the bad is what all try to avoid, so, something like that. That's a principle, first principle, and then comes the first precept. The precept formulates an oath. You must do the good. You must avoid to. And with that precept, can the practical reason, do his work. But sorry, I can't give you a satisfying answer to the principle only known by the wise. Yeah?
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question, you've written excellently in Participation and Substantiality on Aquinas' systematic and metaphysical explanation of participation. Do you see that connecting here with his language of participation in the natural law? And if so, how or why not?
Not immediately, no. I think this is a different context with different accents in the use of participation. In my dissertation, I left the natural law outside of consideration. As well, this is another important use of participation in the context of the doctrine of grace. Grace is nothing else than participated likeness of God's nature. And also a kind of systematically important use of participation there. But the basic participation in the metaphysics of Aquinas is about participation in being. So each creature participates being, received from God, and it participates being according to some essence of nature. That is, to be a creature means to be ens per participationem. And total dependency on the principle of creation. At the same time, the Creator has received his own being according to a nature. So it creates, it constitutes an immanent order. Now, some elements of that will return in the discussion of natural law. But such a term as likeness, similitudo, does not play a role in the discussion of natural law. Yeah, okay.
We're running short on time, and I can't say no to Professor Porter, so we'll just have two last questions.
I think mine is pretty simple. I'm just wondering, sorry. Thank you for your talk. I think my question's fairly simple. I'm just wondering how you know which natural inclinations are indicators of the eternal law and to be followed.
Aye, yeah. Yeah, very simple. one of my first versions of this text, I had a whole. I tried to explain what the difference was between natural inclination according to Aquinas and what makes this notion of natural inclination so problematic for us modern people. But we don't know that nature and natural inclination. For us, it's an inclination, a kind of factual urge, of a factual inclination to do something. But it is not following from a teleologically organized nature. So if Thomas speaks on natural inclinations, we would ask the question, yeah, but why would a natural inclination an inclination for the good? Since Kant, we all know that all people are inclined to do the bad, to do evil. So there is a lot of to say about it. But Thomas speaks in this context about natural inclination in presupposition that the natural inclinations are the work of eternal reason in his creative providing activity. Thus we may put a trust in those natural inclinations. And our institutions are the basic goods to preserve life. I think it don't need a lot of discussion. Yeah?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk, and this is a subject that a lot of us have been interested in for a long time, and it is very difficult. So let me make a couple of observations and raise a question. My first observation is that Aquinas doesn't ever say that the inclinations yield precepts. What he says is that the precepts of the natural law are ordered by reference to the inclinations, which makes sense because the inclinations are actually not judgments of reason, they're acts of an appetite, the appetite of the will, and the inclinations track the natural objects of the will. So this is how you get order out of the multitude of precepts of the natural law. Second thing, Aquinas says that to every inclination there corresponds a virtue, which says to me at least, and says to some of us, not all of us, that the inclinations as such and taken in themselves do not yield norms for action, that there can be good and bad ways of pursuing the inclinations, and you have to understand the virtue proper to each inclination in order to know what those norms are. And so those two observations are to set up the question, can you say a little more about what you think is morally normative about the inclinations, and if the inclinations alone are not morally normative, what other considerations have to be brought to bear in order to take them as action-guiding principles?
Thank you very much. Partly is some kind of addition to what I said, and I totally agree with that, especially about the virtues. But the natural inclinations. My point was the natural inclinations in themselves has not a normative value. They don't represent obligations directly. There is a formulation, So speak about Aquinas in Rudi. 94. This is, I think, a very important and difficult formulation. Where I read it in Latin, if you don't mind. Quia via bonum habet rationem finis, malum auto rationem contrarii, indes dat quod omnia illa atque homo habet naturalem inclinationem, ratio naturalite apprehendet ut bona. This text, that means it's difficult to interpret this text, but it means that only when the ratio, when it is mediated with the law of reason, that the natural inclinations receive a kind of normativity. They must be apprehended by reason as a good, naturalita. And that makes them precepts of the natural law. But there's much more to say about this, of course. Yeah?
Before we conclude, I have one announcement, but in good Thomistic fashion, it will be in 7 parts. First, Mass will be at 5:15 in the Basilica, and our celebrant and homilist tonight is Cardinal Mueller. For those who are attending the banquet will be at 6:15 in Corbett Family Hall on the 7th floor. And, of course, as you all know, at 8 p.m., there'll be a live performance by the Hillbilly Thomists. Now, if you're registered for the conference and you indicated that you wanted a ticket for the concert at registration, please check your email for information. If you are attending the banquet tonight and you have a reserved ticket, you'll pick it up at the end of the banquet in Corbett Hall. If you're not attending the banquet and you have a reserved ticket, you can pick it up at DeBartolo Performing Arts Center tonight, but you have to pick it up by 7:45. If you don't have a reserved ticket and you want to attend the concert, you can go to DeBartolo Performing Arts Center and stand in the standby line. Reserved tickets that are not picked up by 7:45 will be released to people who are in the standby line. Okay, 7 parts. Good. So please join me in thanking Professor Velde.